The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining me. I'm Charles Christian and this is episode 32, the 6th of September edition of the Weird Tales Radio Show podcast, available on iTunes and all the usual podcast platforms. Continuing on from last week, we have another interview in our series looking at neo-paganism today. I know, is Cthulhu going to take over the world? But first, here's Janie with a roundup of anniversaries, paranormal, weird, or otherwise.
Hello, how are you? Nice you could join us. Well, the big news is that this week is the Weird Tales radio show's first birthday. I know, I couldn't believe it. We've been going now a whole 12 months. Yeah, that is right. I'm just checking with figures here. And we look forward to being with you for many more years to come, if you'll have us. Anyway, next up, we have one of those peculiar English anniversaries for today. The 6th of September is Royal Oak Day, as in the tree. So this celebrates the fact that on the 6th of September in the year 1651, the man who would later become King Charles II spent the day hiding in an oak tree near Boscobel House in the west of England, after seeing his royalist army resoundingly thrashed by Oliver Cromwell's Roundheads in what was proved to be the final battle of the English Civil War. Well, Charles escaped capture and less than 10 years afterwards reclaimed the English throne, while the incident gave rise to hundreds of English pubs being called the Royal Oak. So I'd always wondered about that. Although the original Boscobel oak tree fell down years ago, and a descendant known as Son of Royal Oak, and now several hundred years old itself, still stands in the grounds of Boscobel House. Incidentally, for those of you who are gardeners, you can buy saplings certified as grown from the sun's acorns from the English Heritage Shop at Boscobel House. This is not an info commercial, by the way. I'm just throwing that in there for info.
Yes.
Anyway, today's haunting involves a ghost of a typically English character, namely John Mad Jack as Mytton or Myton. Let's call him Myton. Mutton just sounds mad, doesn't it?
Yes.
Anyway, he's a real person.
Myton, yes.
Myton, who every 30th of September, which was his birthday, haunts Myton and Mermaid Hotel at Atcham in Shropshire. All right, this is his story. In the early years of the 19th century, John Myton, who you'll soon learn definitely deserves the moniker Mad Jack, earned a reputation for being a Regency rake and eccentric. He apparently inherited a huge estate of over 130,000 acres on the Welsh borders and an annual income of £10,000 a year. That £10,000 is the equivalent of £750,000 a year today, or just under $1 million US. So quite rich then. He dabbled in politics, spending £750,000, getting himself elected as Member of Parliament. And he came up with this cunning wheeze, which I think maybe other parties in this country need to adopt, through the cunning wheeze of handing out £10 notes to everyone he encountered.
I'll vote for him.
Yeah, that works for me. However, he spent just 30 minutes in the House of Commons before deciding it was boring and he never went there again.
Money well spent then.
His main interest was fox hunting. Hunting in all weathers from the age of 10 years old, and reportedly owning 150 pairs of hunting breeches, 700 pairs of handmade leather hunting boots, 1,000 hats, and 3,000 shirts. Now, I can understand how the visits to the tack shop and buying equipment for your horsey passion can get a little out of hand.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm rather more concerned that he had rather more pairs of boots than he did trousers.
I hadn't spotted that. Yeah.
Anyway.
That. Okay. He's also said to have kept a pack of 2,000 dogs and took 2,000 bottles of port with him when he very briefly, must be said, attended Cambridge University.
He found that boring as well, apparently.
Probably boring, yeah.
Yes.
On one occasion for a bet, he rode a horse into a crowded dining room of a local hotel, then up the grand staircase onto the balcony, from which he jumped, still seated on his horse, over the diners in the restaurant below, and then crashed through a window before heading off back outside. Like you do.
Like you do.
He also held lordship of the manor of a village in Wales and would give half a guinea to any of the local children prepared to roll all the way down a nearby mountain. So a bit of a sicko, really. Yeah. I think the next bit, though, I'm going to tell you about really does nail the Mad Jack side of him. There was a time when he was drunk, obviously, and preparing for bed. He decided the way to cure a bout of hiccups was to set fire to his nightshirt. Instantly, he was obviously engulfed in flames, and he was only saved from a fiery death by a quick-thinking servant who beat out the flames. But apparently, oblivious to all this, he promptly exclaimed, "The hiccup is gone," and staggered off to bed.
Yeah,
naked.
must remember that next time you have hiccups.
Yeah. Actually, he sounds like a fun guy, doesn't he? The sort of one you quite like to knock around with, because you never know what stuff he's going to do next, but feel slightly alarmed all the time. Anyway, naturally, it all ended badly, as he was running up huge debts, not least as he had an ex-wife, a mistress, and 6 children to support. But being told that he could only avoid bankruptcy if he limited his expenditure to just £6,000 a year for 6 years, the modern equivalent of that would be £450,000 a year, he replied, "I wouldn't give a damn to live on £6,000 a year." Anyway, he initially did flee to France to avoid his creditors, but eventually returned to England and was imprisoned for debt, dying in the King's Bench prison in Southwark, London in 1834. At the time of his death, he was described as a round-shouldered, tottering, old/young man, bloated by drink, worn out by too much foolishness, too much wretchedness, and too much brandy. He was just 37 years old. His haunting of the Mytton and Mermaid Hotel every September is said to recall a happier time in his life. Incidentally, for many years, students at the University of Minnesota campus in Minneapolis used to hold a Mad Jack Mytton run, which was an annual streaking event. I don't know if they perhaps had their nightshirts on fire as well.
There is a story that when he was out hunting, he'd sometimes get so hot he'd throw his clothes off and would continue hunting naked.
Ouch, is what I could say.
Yes. Thank you for that one.
You're welcome.
For our second neo-pagan interview, we are talking to Maryland-based Brian Smith, who practices the Theodish belief. This is a modern reconstruction. It was founded in 1976 of the old pagan Anglo-Saxon religious practices.
My name is Brian Smith. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States of America. I am 44 years old, and I have been interested in the general pagan phenomenon since, about the age of 14, 15 years old, so almost 30 years now. I have been an active participant in that community since the age of 18, and I have been particularly active in the what would be called the Germanic heathen religions since around that time as well.
What attracted you at the early age?
I am your prototypical Catholic kid gone bad. I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church. My parents are Catholic, not particularly devout, but Catholic by tradition.
Yeah.
I had attended Franciscan and Jesuit schools. And I guess my original attraction was basically antinomian in the respect that I was, it must be something rotten. It must be something interesting about these things that we're told are rotten. So I'm going to go delve into it, see what they hold. I suppose my original interests were motivated strictly by a desire to annoy my parents and to thumb my nose at the things I had been raised in.
Yeah.
And I would say those probably guided me through my first few years into the subject. And somehow, somewhere along the way, I found myself being religious. What I thought was an exercise in irreligious behavior became a exploration into religious behavior. And these things that I was doing to annoy my parents and society at large started to resonate with me on a spiritual and religious level. It was quite an interesting thing when you wake up one day and you realize, I actually believe this. And you have a new sense of zeal, I suppose, and you seek to explore it ever more. So, Catholic kid gone bad.
What was it then in paganism that made you think, hey, there's something real here?
Well, it was a mixture of looking at things from a very rational standpoint. The idea of a omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent God just doesn't seem to make sense when you consider how vast the world is. And when you start to think to yourself, if a being is all-powerful and all-knowledge, it effectively cancels itself out. One can be all-powerful, one can be all-knowledgeable, but one cannot be both. I suppose it was the Heisenberg uncertainty principle of religion. You can know where something is, or you can know how fast it's moving, but you can't know both at the same time. But beyond that, once I got the intellectual aspects of it and found the academic side of things to be intriguing, a genuine sense of religiosity developed within me. For lack of a better word, I had not a hierophany. I experienced an emotional, what Rudolf Otto, the famous theologian, would call the numinosum tremendum, the powerful force of these things that I had claimed to have been worshiping, and they became very well known to me on that level, that terrifying, awe-inspiring aspect of the divine. And from that moment, it was like, oh, well, I've made the telephone call and something has answered back. So I guess I best pay attention to the conversation that's happening. And that just led me further and further. In the Havamal, which is a collection of maxims or poems in the Poetic Edda, Havamal means words of the High One. These are supposed to be the words of the Norse god Odin. He says very interestingly, he says, one word led me to another word, which led me to more words. One work led me to another work, which led me to more works. And that has been the pretty much the story of my life. One word leading me on, one work leading me on, ever deeper into this, not just so much the academic aspect of it, but the actual religious and spiritual aspect of the religion.
Mm-hmm. What's intriguing is obviously paganism in its various forms.
Well, I myself actually practice a version of the Germanic religions that's Anglo-Saxon oriented. So I have a great affinity for English culture and the English language. English is my mother tongue, and not too far removed from Old English. I can sight read Beowulf if necessary, but close enough that usually the springing board is the more developed and more recorded Norse mythology. What attracted me to the Germanic gods? I think that they seemed both fascinating yet familiar at the same time. When I was younger, having been raised in what my mom would call an Irish household, although we didn't really have any affinity for Irish culture, we just had the last name that was Irish. I tried to study and connect with the Tuatha De Danann of the Irish legends and Irish mythology, and while very fascinating on an academic level, they seemed foreign to me. They didn't seem particularly humane or human in that regard, and so I didn't develop an emotional response to them. But when I got a little bit older and I started to explore the Germanic side of things, these were very, I want to say they felt natural. They felt good. They felt like I could connect to them on some kind of emotional and spiritual level. And then it was just moving on into, okay, well, English is my mother language, and my family comes from a little area right outside of Berkshire, and it was an exploration in as much of my own ancestry as it was into the religion. And here I am today.
So, in a nutshell, a big nutshell, what parts of the Norse and Germanic myths are embodied in the religion then?
If you're speaking of the general quote-unquote heathen community, a lot of it is based upon the poetic and prose eddas. I'll be perfectly honest, I'm a little critical of the general heathen world because so much of it is it's based upon just the myths. And I've always told people you can no more understand a heathen religion by reading its myths than you could understand a Catholic Mass by reading the Bible. You just don't. There's a correlation between religion and myth, but there isn't necessarily a causation. Myth explains ritual, not the other way around necessarily. So, but in the general heathen world, there's a lot of taking of the ideas from the sagas and the eddas, and applying that information that was written down in the 12th century, and almost just saying, okay, this is the religion. Not a great deal of theological thought involved. Not a lot of deep thinking on the subject. They tout that there's a heathenry is the religion with homework, and so many of them are not doing their homework.
Yes.
But that's okay, because not every person is meant to be a theologian. Not every person is meant to be a priest. In that regard, we're very different from other pagan religions, such as Wicca, where every man is a priest and every woman is a priestess of the craft. So those sorts of religious specializations aren't necessary to practice it.
Right.
But a lot of people place a great deal on ancestry. And that is to the detriment of the practices in a lot of ways. It can lead to a sense of racial superiority amongst some that has haunted. It has haunted the Germanic religious revival since its foundation. a lot of people out there who are not racist or do not have racialist leanings lament the fact that racists and racialists are, quote unquote, taking over the religion.
Okay, so what then does the religion side of it actually comprise?
Okay, when it comes down to the praxis, the primary rituals in Germanic religions are two. The first one being called blot in either Old Norse or Old English. They share the word, and that means basically sacrifice. In old times, that would usually involve animal sacrifice by the group.
Yeah.
Making offerings to the gods in that capacity, and then preparing the sacrificed animal in a ritual meal called in Old Norse a fetslo, or in Old English a husel. It basically meant a meal, a feast. And the other ritual is a ritual of boasting and making oaths and pledges. It's called in Old English symbol. In the Beowulf poem, Hrothgar says to his people, "Sit now to symbol, sit now to the symbol feast," which was a drinking ritual amongst men that had connections and implications to the layers of time and causality, which are called weird in Old English. We hear about the weird sisters,
the weird
sisters,
sisters,
and what have you.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And it's basically a ritual where people speak of things that they have done, and they put things into the weird, the well of the weird, and things that they plan to do, and stake their honor and name on to get greater acclaim amongst their people, to word fame amongst them. But those are the two primary rituals, and the important thing is that they're social rituals. A person does not sacrifice on their own. Having a sacrifice and a meal to the gods on your own is not conducive. And symbol obviously cannot be performed by one person because it's witnessed by people and it's a participatory affair. So I think the primary crux of heathen religions, as opposed to practices such as Wicca, where one can be a solitary, is its community. It's a very communal-based religion, just as it would have been in ancient times.
Gotcha. Yeah. Righto. So bringing it forward to the modern day, obviously you're not sacrificing animals. What do you do instead of that?
Well, some traditions actually do engage in animal sacrifice. It's always done by somebody who's skilled in husbandry and in dispatching animals in a safe and humane way, something like you would see in an abattoir or an American slaughterhouse. It's not by any stretch of the means the common thing. In places where those sorts of offerings aren't made, the groups will usually offer things of a constable offerings like food and drink, so they can make the offering yet still have a feast afterwards.
Yes.
In the same spirit as the ancients. Quite often, this is usually alcoholic beverages because mead plays such an important role in the Norse and English legends.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's also grains, because you have the traditions of lamas and harvest home and what have you.
Yeah.
So it's very easily translated into more modern practices that can't engage in animal sacrifice. I can't imagine people in London flats or in New York apartments offering animals. That just wouldn't be practical.
Yeah.
Just from a hygienic standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you have a particular cycle that you do these? I mean, we hear a lot about the 8 points of the Wheel of the Year. Do you have a particular calendar you follow?
Well, amongst the general heathen community, they surprisingly stick to a very similar 8-point Wheel of the Year.
Yeah.
But amongst my folk and amongst the people who are part of my tradition, we eschew that. We don't have 8 holidays. We have 4. We have the ones that are pretty much documented by folks like the Venerable Bede and others. There's the around the winter solstice we have Yule, and that's a very ancient word. It's our modern English Yule, Yule.
Yeah.
Then we have in the springtime we have Easter.
Yeah.
And there's some controversy as to whether Easter was a goddess or a season or what have you, but we know that a celebration amongst Anglo-Saxon pagans took place around that time.
Yeah.
And then we have Litha, which would be the middle of summer, midsummer, around the summer solstice. And that, again, is a tide that was recorded by the Venerable Bede. And then we have basically a harvest festival in the fall. Winter Philith would be the Old English word for it. The winter's full moon. It marks the beginning of the time of the year where things start to get cold. The eight wheel or the 8 points of the wheel thing, that seems to be a duplication of both Germanic holidays and Gaelic holidays that were kind of fused together during the Gardnerian synthesis of Wicca.
Yes.
Some people subscribe to it. Many do not.
Have you any gauge on the number of people in the US who are following your tradition?
Well, my particular tradition, no. You could probably get every person who's ever been a part of my tradition into a high school gymnasium, and there would still be plenty of room for people to dance in.
Yeah.
But the general heathen community, what Americans generally call alzatru, after the Icelandic word, or just heathenry in general, it has become very popular over the last few years. I attribute that to the rise of Viking metal music and the black metal scene that came out of the early 2000s in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
In addition to the general fad of Vikings, we have this dreadful show on the History Channel, Vikings.
Yeah.
Everybody wears too much mascara, and nobody has any color in their wardrobe, and it's not a very fair representation of Norse culture during that time period. But for some reason, it's latched on, and people seem to really like it, and as a result, they start doing what they believe to be ancient heathen religions, which is I don't know. I would say that the heathenry they're practicing is about as authentic as the Wicca is to medieval witchcraft. It's inspired by it, but not necessarily informed by it.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I mean, in the UK, some aspects of pagan practice, it's really more like sort of medieval cosplay rather than anything else. Right, okay. Now, you interestingly use the phrase heathenry and also paganism. Do you use them interchangeably, or do you see them just being two aspects of the same thing?
Well, I would say that paganism is the larger umbrella, of which heathenry sits underneath. Heathenry being a smaller umbrella, which encompasses many different Germanic-based religions. So pagan, if I say pagan, I'm speaking of anybody who subscribes to generally what paganism is, which would be an ancient pre-Christian religion or a modern recreation thereof, neo-paganism, ancient paganism, things that are inspired by those things, like Wicca. Heathenry itself would be a little closer to a more historic practice, but even then we have our fair share of people who have very romantic ideas about the ancient past, all the way down to people, say, in my tradition, which is called Thetish belief, where we try very hard to be academically sound in our practice and our approach. So little smaller umbrellas under larger umbrellas, I would say, would be my understanding of those terms.
Is there any hierarchy in your belief system?
In my particular tradition, yes, we have a very rigid social structure amongst our congregants, but in many of the larger heathen communities, they have a very egalitarian sense of, I bow to no God, I bow to no man, we all stand as equals. Once again, not a very historic perspective of how ancient societies ordered themselves, but once again, very romantic, a very ideas based upon the band of Viking brothers called the Jomsvikings. There's a Jomsviking saga, which is a story about a bunch of Vikings who were very egalitarian and very didn't bow to others and what have you, and that strongly influenced the heathen religions as they grew out from the 1970s on. My tradition, on the other hand, we're the exact opposite. We have people who are the leaders, we have people who are the facilitators, we have people who are the followers, for lack of a better word. And so in that regards, we're kind of at odds with the greater community.
That's fascinating. Any other things you need to mention or things we should be talking about, Brian?
Well, I think that when we talk about any kind of religion based upon historical religions or even inspired by them, what we have to understand is that it's impossible to recreate those religions completely. It's like trying to step in a river. You'll never step in the river at the same time or the same way twice. The water has flowed, the water has moved. And so we can get an idea of what our ancestors were doing. We can get an idea of those practices, but we can't really we can't recreate it 100%. We have to make it something that's applicable and understandable to us. But through seeking out their way of thinking, by studying their languages, by studying their culture, by studying their architecture, their archaeology, what have you, we can get a better idea of what it meant to think as an ancient heathen. That right there is the biggest problem we have in the modern world. Our entire worldview, our Weltanschauung, is based in a Judeo-Christian guilt culture, whereas our ancestors lived in a pre-Christian shame culture, and coming to terms with that and leads to a greater understanding of what they were really about. So much of the religion today is learning to think, simply think as they did. And it's a constant struggle, but rewarding.
But rewarding. That's brilliant. Well, I think on that note, that's a very good point to end. So, Brian Smith, many thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. I'm very glad we got to meet each other through the Folk Horror Facebook page.
Yeah,
I am a huge fan of British cinema from the 60s and 70s. I'm a huge Hammer fan. The Wicker Man is my favorite movie, and I like it the best because the good guys win.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's it, we're almost out of time, but there's just room to squeeze in one final story. It follows up on one of our Practical Magick reports in an earlier show, and we're looking at why magic spells sometimes don't work. I know, the cynics among you are going to say, well, the reason magic doesn't work is because it doesn't exist. But we're not cynics here on the Weird Tales radio show. We're skeptics, we're open-minded, and prepared to be convinced by the evidence. So, here are our top 7 reasons why your magic spells may not be working. The first is you're not giving it enough time. Much as you may want to get things done in a flash, sometimes things take a while. You've got to move through the most convenient channels. So be patient. A second reason, number 2, is that you don't actually want the thing you're casting your spell for. If your heart isn't in it, it's not going to work. Magic is a culmination of emotion, imagination, and will. For a spell to work, you must have all 3 aspects in alignment with each other. If you only have 1 or 2, they're going to counteract each other, and you're just not going to get anywhere with it. Number 3, your intention isn't clear. It sounds straightforward, but a lot of people still fall over on this one. If you don't know what you want, how is your magic supposed to make it happen? Think carefully. Your intentions must be specific rather than just generic. Reason number 4, you're trying to shove too many intentions into one spell. You get excited by casting spells, so you want to throw in many things at once. Once again, keep it simple. Focus on just one thing. Cast for that and achieve that. Focus. Reason number 5, you're nullifying your own spells. Stress maybe, worry, nagging thoughts, lots of things in the back of your mind. This isn't going to work. How's this going to work? Am I really doing it right? Again, you're just not going to get anywhere with that. Problem number 6 is you don't actually believe that what you want is possible. So once again, your own mind is holding back and nullifying the effectiveness of your spell. If you don't think it's possible, how are you going to achieve it? You've got to have some confidence in what you're attempting to do. However, there is an important caveat here, and this is number 7. You shouldn't try to cast for something that's actually impossible. For example, flying through the air, turning into a vampire, being able to throw fireballs from your fingertips, the kind of stuff you see in fantasy movies. Those things are impossible, and it doesn't matter how much you try, you're never going to achieve them. We have a little thing called the laws of physics. They govern the world we live in. And if you try to do anything that contravenes the laws of physics, it ain't going to work. So there you have it. 7 reasons why your spells may not work. Basically, you have to have faith in yourself, you have to have a clear objective, and you have to aim for things that are achievable, not impossible. Food for thought, I hope. Anyway, I look forward to joining you again in a week's time, but until then, may your gods and goddesses protect you from ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties and things that go bump in the night. Good night.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, magic, and folklore. Keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com or by email at urbanfantasist.icloud.com or on Twitter at Christian Uncut. Good night. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show.